You need to build an emergency fund, but do you have one? Like, what's it even for? Do you have too much or too little? And where should you even keep it? In this video, you're going to learn exactly what an emergency fund is, what's it for, how to calculate how much you need, and where you should store this capital so you don't leave yourself at risk. More about that later on. My name is Jacob Topley. I'm an international financial advisor based here in Mexico City and Latin America in general. And my job is to help my clients open up international investment accounts that are in stronger currencies. Before we begin, if you haven't seen my last video about the 50-30-20 rule, it might be quite helpful if you had a look, because in order to calculate an emergency fund, you need to budget and understand what your requirements are from a month-to-month basis and what you actually need in order to live. So what are you spending your money on? You can check that out here. Okay, well, what is an emergency fund for then? And it is a bit self-explanatory. It's a fund of money designed to take care of you in an emergency. An emergency is one of two things. It could be an unexpected expense that you didn't have time to plan for and would cost you typically more than what you'd have sitting in your bank account. Examples of that could be an unforeseen medical expense. After insurance, you've got to pay some capital. Could even be an emergency trip, such as the death of a loved one, meaning you need to travel to go and be with family. Even as far as a problem in your home country that would force you to want to take your family and leave. Political instability, hyperinflation, natural disasters and such. An emergency is also described as a loss of your primary income. Now, it's important that you only dip into your emergency fund for one of those reasons. No other reason should you be looking at your emergency fund for whatever it is that you want to do. So now we know what we need the emergency fund to actually cover and protect us from, but why do we actually need one though? If you don't have an emergency fund to cover these expenses, if and when they come up, you're putting yourself and your family at the risk of financial ruin. For most people, the only way that they can afford to pay for unexpected medical bills, home repairs, or take care of themselves if they lost their job is actually by taking on a fair amount of debt in the process. For a lot of people, the debt that they take on in these situations can actually be quite encumbersome. It can be very painful because there's a possibility that later down the line they can't afford to pay this new debt, so they still lose the house and they can't pay the rent and so on. But even more likely, you've taken on this debt and now you have to start making some quality of life sacrifices. You can't go out to eat with the family as often. You can't go to the cinema, the movies, and do things with your family. You have to cut back on your hobbies because you didn't put that money aside to take care of, any unforeseen expense. To be quite brutally honest, by not having an emergency fund, you're putting yourself, your family, and your loved ones, at risk. The most important factor for calculating your emergency fund is kind of looking at a worst case scenario that's not so unrealistic. For most people, that's going to be losing your primary source of income or your only source of income and having to wait a while to find something to actually bring more income in. In other words, you've lost your job, you need to find a new one. That's how you should calculate your emergency fund, because that is the most common situation that you're going to be in. To work out exactly how much you spend on your core needs, things that you absolutely can't live without, basic food, how much you're paying for your rent, how much you're paying on car payments, how much you're paying on your insurances, so on and so on. Core needs, and also some of the wants that make your life that little bit better that you really wouldn't want to live without. For a lot of families, that could be something like the kids' activities after school. That you want to take them to that boxing class, you want to take them to the piano lesson because it's good for your family, right? So, for example, you and your partner, you have rent and bills that add up to, let's say, $2,000 a month. You spend $750 on groceries, $750 worth of insurance and car payments. And now that you've started, you really should continue with those. And you also have 2 children. You send them to a private school, and that's $1,000 a month each. So that totals $5,500 per month. That's how much you're expending on things that you absolutely need in this example. $5,500 a month. People get this wrong all the time. All the time. I see it so often. People are so concerned about building this huge emergency fund when there's very little risk of them losing their job without getting a severance pay, without getting some form of financial compensation. So if you and your partner are both employed, your emergency fund doesn't need to be as big as if you were self-employed. A severance pay is a payment from your employer that's made to you if they decide to fire you or let you go. So the emergency fund in this case for this family should be around 3 times the monthly expenses. However, with kids, with children, I always want to advise my clients to be a little bit more cautious. Therefore, you could build an emergency fund, up to 6 months in that case, but minimum 3. A lot of people say that you need a minimum of 6. I think that's just being overly cautious because there's a lot more important things you could be doing with, in this case, $15,000 contributed to an investment would be a lot more productive than it's sat there potentially just not really doing anything for your financial security. Or actually, if you're heavily reliant on commissions, let's say you work in sales, or you're heavily reliant on bonuses, for example, you get a big bonus at the end of the year but not a great salary, you'd want to go a bit higher. So I'd recommend a minimum of 6, maybe 9, maybe even 12 months in that case. What this really boils down to is that everyone's situation is slightly different. You might want more in your emergency fund, you might want less. You might want, in the case of an emergency, to actually be able to just continue living life as though nothing had happened until you've got time to get back on your feet, which could be 3 to 6 months. If it makes you feel more comfortable having 9 months worth of expenses, have the 9 months worth of expenses. Just be advised that potentially you've got thousands and thousands of US dollars that you could be putting to work in a more productive way that's going to help you out in the future and actually act as a bit of an emergency and security against your future well-being, not just in an emergency. So now that you kind of have an idea about how much you're going to need as a minimum, now you need to decide what you're going to do in terms of storing and keeping this wealth available and accessible to you. Because an emergency fund is all about protecting you and your family, naturally you should also want to protect your emergency fund as well. But what do we need to protect it against? Well, there's a few key ideas here: inflation, theft, political instability, actual currency instability, so depreciation of a local currency, loss of the currency in physical terms. Maybe you've got bank failures in there as well. You want to protect against that. And above all else, we need to make sure that cash is liquid. It needs to be accessible pretty much 24/7. After all, how can that cash protect us if we can't actually use it? And there's a couple of ways you could go about doing this. I actually recommend doing both. Having some capital in physical cash or even physical assets, and having some of your capital well stored within a bank or an institution. In Latin America, political instability and currency devaluation or inflation are kind of our biggest enemies. It's important to consider that actually having an emergency fund should be done in a currency or in an economy that's going to be as stable as possible. Physical cash in a strong currency or even a local currency is obviously vulnerable to theft, it's vulnerable to natural disasters, your house could burn down and you've lost your entire emergency fund, so that's something to take into consideration as well. One of the massive benefits though of having something physical that you can actually touch and use and move around is that it's 100% liquid accessible. You've got it straight away, you can use it straight away as needed. I think that's an advantage that some of you might find really attractive, for others it's not so important. We live in a digital world. I think most people would choose to keep their capital in a well-established financial institution. I would be on the lookout for banks that have high interest savings accounts or even high liquidity, highly secure investment options that traditionally keep up with inflation and don't have much volatility. Think bonds, think gold, things that you can absolutely sell within 24 hours and have in your regular bank account, but that kind of keep your money up with inflation. It's not advised to kind of properly invest your emergency funds though. You may also want to consider leaving a portion of your money with some banks, but also having some physical cash on hand. It's really going to depend on your personal preference, what your risk tolerance is, and what you would like to do with your emergency fund. If you live in Latin America, like me, you should almost 100% try and get your emergency fund into a strong currency. Swiss francs, euros, British pounds, US dollars, historically the most stable currencies over the past 100 years. You never know when a situation like Argentina or Venezuela is going to occur, and having some or all of your emergency fund assets in a historically strong and accessible currency is going to much better increase its effectiveness, protect you a bit against the devaluation of local currencies anyway, and just be a little bit more safer and give you more of a peace of mind. Although it's always advised to keep some local currency in an emergency fund anyway. So there you are, ladies and gentlemen, a full look at the why, what, when, where and how of emergency funds. If you enjoyed this video, don't forget to subscribe and share it with someone that you think I might be able to help. Once again, this is Jacob Topley, and I'm pretty sure that I'll see you in the next one.